All right, here we go. Fun topic today, right?
Yes. Well,
That's
so
right. Fun
fun.
is not the right word. It's another F word we have in mind for today.
Exactly. This is a term that really resonated with me because not only does it feel like it from the patient perspective, but I have to say I feel like this from my perspective as the physician. And I can tell you I had quite the doozy this morning in terms of a WTF moment post an IVF cycle.
That's what we're going to talk about, that WTF appointment. And this is a term that we saw on social media and we fell in love with it because it is so accurate. First of all, for anybody who is unfamiliar, the WTF appointment is kind of an inside joke or a euphemism that stands for what the fertility or another F words. Depends on your mood.
Yes, the second version with a slightly different F word, maybe about 4 letters, truly encompasses exactly the feeling we, as in the fertility dot, get when things don't go the way we expected them to. So, let's talk about it.
We're going to do a whole series of episodes covering the different variations of that WTF appointment from things like embryo transfer, egg retrievals, maturity eggs, poor fertilization, basically all the different aspects where you're kind of looking at it and thinking, what the actual F is going on?
Today's episode is going to be the first in our series. We're going to be covering what it means when the egg retrieval doesn't go the way that we, again, meaning you as the patient and us as the fertility doctor, it didn't go the way that we expected. Specifically, sometimes we end up with a lot less mature eggs to work with than we expected.
That happens, unfortunately, not infrequently. Patients start with a follicle count or an expectation based on the stimulation, and then boom, you do a retrieval. And sometimes the moment they wake up, you need to have that conversation saying, listen, we didn't get as many eggs as expected. And that could be really frustrating for definitely the patient that was coming in with those expectations and holding out to that hope of the specific number of eggs, but also for the fertility doctor because we were also going in there thinking we're going to get the eggs. Sometimes the ovaries or the body has different plans in mind.
This is definitely a gut punch moment. Let's unpack why this happens and how we as the clinicians can approach these conversations.
The first thing is let's talk about expectations. How do we get our expectations about the number of eggs that we think we're going to get at the time of egg retrievals? This comes from the assessment of ovarian reserve. That comes from two things. One is the blood work for a hormone called anti-Mullerian hormone level. And another one is for ultrasound, an ultrasound that is done in the first part of the menstrual cycle in the follicular phase that looks at the antrafollicle count. So the antrafollicle count and the AMH level sets the expectation for the number of eggs that we're going to get at egg retrieval before the stimulation even starts.
But let's be super clear. Just because we see, for instance, 12 follicles on an antral follicle count ultrasound, the assumption may be that we're going to get 12 eggs. But unfortunately, it's really not that simple. Not every follicle will have a mature egg, and not every follicle will respond the same way to stimulation.
We normally set the protocol based on that initial information. If somebody has a high AMH level, then we give less medication because we don't want to overstimulate them. If somebody has a low to medium AMH level, then we give a higher dose of the medication, trying to get as many eggs as possible. But even with the best protocol, we do see a lot of variability. Sometimes you can do a low dose stim cycle where you're getting less medication and getting more number of eggs or vice versa.
Yes, there is so much variability cycle to cycle, and we see it all the time. I mean, there are some patients who might do IVFs, 2, 3 months in a row, and you can get very wildly different egg number outcomes, even with the same patient, even with the same protocol. And that's what makes it so tough to figure out how to make these predictions.
We use the AMH label and the follicle count to set up the protocol to stimulate the ovaries. But the ovaries have a mind of their own, and sometimes they respond differently to the stimulation that with the ovarian reserve expectation that we had. Sometimes the ovaries produce more follicles than we expected, and sometimes they produce less. The final sort of assessment of the number of eggs that we're expecting at the time of retrieval is the ultrasound that we're doing during the stimulation, in particularly the number of follicles that are 1.7 centimeters or higher when we do the ultrasound on the last day of your stimulation, which is the day of the trigger. That is the ultrasound that we use besides the ovarian reserve testing, which is only what we use prior to starting the cycle. But that is the ultrasound that we use to determine how many mature eggs we should be expecting at the time of retrieval.
And this is actually a really important point because there's so many patients who we might be seeing on the morning of the retrieval and their ultrasound on the day of trigger maybe showed, I don't know, 15, 20 follicles. But the follicles that are 1.2, 1.3, 1.1 in size, although they're measured, we don't expect him to contain a mature egg. And therefore, it's really those follicles that are at that certain size that are going to help us predict the egg number. Sometimes it's not even that we got less eggs than maybe you and I expected as the clinicians, but it's really important about setting expectations appropriately so that patients know kind of how we're making those determinations for what we think is quote unquote good from the retrieval itself.
And on that note, and I can't speak for all fertility doctors, but certainly the ones at MSC, we do go after every follicle that we see, even if they're measuring 1.2, 1.3, 1.4. But we do use the 1.7 of higher to determine the number of mature eggs that we're going to obtain. But it doesn't mean that we're leaving follicles behind or that we are discriminating based on the size of the follicle.
Yes, absolutely true. Very good point. Okay, so now we've kind of, set expectations. We have a good idea of how we're going to predict the number of eggs we get. But then there are issues that can come up at the time of the retrieval itself that can lead to less eggs than expected. And this is one that I don't think we necessarily talk so much about, or maybe there's not so much literature or research. This is not one that people talk about, on social media, right? When patients are talking amongst themselves. And that is that some retrievals are simply way more technically challenging and way more difficult than other retrievals. And that can be for a slew of reasons. And we're going to go into that. But certainly, anytime a procedure like a retrieval is more difficult, more challenging, we're going to get sweatier. We may also not be able to get every egg from every follicle as easily, unfortunately, with a challenging retrieval.
So, what is a challenging retrieval? For example, sometimes there could be things like big cysts around the ovaries, like endometriomas. They could be fibroids. The most important thing is your health. We're not going to put a needle when we don't see what we're putting the needle through. We're not going to put a needle through a vessel. We're not going to put a needle through bowel. So if the ovaries are not easily seen, or if they're not seen at all, even with pressure and whatnot, because of these things, or there is a bowel present, or there is a vessel present, then we simply cannot put a needle in a way that compromises your health. That would be one of the reasons why, yes, you had all the follicles there, but we couldn't get to them because it wasn't safe to do that due to problems sometimes either visualizing the ovary or accessing the ovary, even if you can see it very clearly.
When we're doing a retrieval, we're putting that ultrasound probe in the vagina and we have a needle on the end of it. And that needle is straight. And so we need to create a straight line from where that probe is to be able to access the follicles in the ovary. Unfortunately, sometimes things just don't line up in that perfectly beautiful straight line. Sometimes somebody can just have anatomically, the ovaries are really high and there can be lots of stuff in the way. We try not to poke endometriomas, to poke those cysts. But again, sometimes the follicle is on top of the endometrioma, and we can't take a straight needle and kind of curve our way around to access that follicle. Again, fibroids, they are tough, they are hard. You can't get a needle through them the vast majority of the time. And they can also move the ovaries, push the ovaries up higher out of the way. For instance, this is something that during the stimulation phase, we may see that this is becoming an issue. But unfortunately, before you start the stim, we actually can't predict how or where the follicles are going to grow in the ovary. So, for instance, sometimes somebody can have a very large endometrioma cyst, but if the follicles are growing sort of underneath it, access can be super easy when we don't enter the endometrium at all. If those follicles are growing sort of on top of the endometrioma, I mean further away, suddenly now access becomes a big issue. And there's no way to know where those follicles are going to grow. And it can vary cycle to cycle. We try and think about access prior to the start of stim, but it's actually a really poor predictor of what access will look like once the stim is actually completed, meaning that we've triggered and that we're at the time of retrieval. So we do what we can to give people a heads up, but it's actually really hard to make that prediction.
Exactly. Another issue that can come up making retrievals really challenging is the issue of sedation. Now, at Markham Fertility Center, we are very lucky that we have anesthesiologists that come from the hospital. They can give our patients really good sedation, more than a typical REI physician is able to do. So we are able to do difficult retrievals or MFC because of that. However, it doesn't mean that we can do everything. Sometimes even with that type of sedation that the anesthesiologist provides, patients sometimes react poorly to the sedation and they can start moving in a way that they can control. So it's not like you're being difficult. It's not like you're not listening. You literally have no control over your body under the medications. And then sometimes the breathing with your abdomen that might happen when you're under sedation, or the way that you are responding to the medications, making your muscle twitch and move, can make the retrieval challenging and unsafe, again, to put a needle through when there is movement happening and you're not in full control of the path of that needle.
Moving targets are way harder than not moving targets. Even under sedation, there's an increased risk that people just even start getting hiccups. That is completely unpredictable, but somebody can start hiccuping once they're sedated, and suddenly now the ovary is like bouncing around with each hiccup. And so even then, once my needle, let's say, is in the ovary can even kind of bounce away and suddenly I've fallen out of the follicle. These are technical issues that can make it more challenging. And again, that are really unpredictable, unfortunately. We work with our anesthesiologists. We communicate with them. We say, hey, maybe a little bit more sedation, maybe less sedation. What can we do to help with this situation? It's not perfect, unfortunately. We can't make every retrieval quote unquote easy, right?
We do have a lot of maneuvers that we can do to get around these issues. And I would say the majority of the time, we do get around these issues and we do get those eggs. But I mean, today we're not talking about the success stories. We're talking about the times that we just don't get enough eggs. That's why it's called a WTF appointment. But I do want to leave it out there because I don't want people to be worried if you're doing your cycle monitoring ultrasound and the ultrasonography says, oh, I see a little bit of bowel, or I see a fibroid, or I see your ovary behind the uterus. I don't want everybody freaking out like, oh my God, that means they're not going to get my eggs. I would say the majority of the time we get around those problems and there's different maneuvers and things that we can do to get them, but sometimes it's just not possible. And that's what we're talking about today.
It's also really worth noting that at Markham Fertility Center, we also do transabdominal retrievals. Not all clinics do them. What that means is I talked about ultrasound probe in vagina, needle at the end of the probe. We're going through kind of the back vaginal wall to access the ovaries. We will also do transabdominal retrievals, meaning that the ultrasound probe is now on top of the stomach and that we're going through the abdominal wall with that needle to be able to access the ovaries. Again, this is, I would say, more technically challenging. It's a more advanced skill in the world of fertility, in the world of REI. Number one. Number two, it certainly goes a lot better when patients are more comfortable and more sedated. So our anesthesiologists are really instrumental in helping us being able to do these things successfully. But when somebody has those big fibroids, those big cysts, those ovaries that are high up, we can also proceed transabdominally. When you're going transabdominally, it is a more challenging retrieval Visualization is a little bit more difficult just with the distance of the thickness of abdominal wall, kind of changing kind of the physics of the image that we're actually seeing on ultrasound. But, it is worth noting that if somebody has been told that they are going to be a more challenging retrieval, or if somebody's been told that their ovaries are not accessible, one thing to consider, one thing to ask about is, hey, do you guys do them transabdominally? Do you think that that's something that would be good for me? If you're working with a clinic that's not able to do those transabdominal retrievals, then it might be good to think about moving to a different clinic that can.
So we just talked about difficulties in getting to the ovaries as a reason for not getting as many eggs as you expected. Now, let's assume that there was no issues whatsoever getting to the ovaries. The physician was able to put that needle into every single follicle, flush it multiple times, aspirated all the fluid, and you're still coming out with less eggs than expected. WTF there? What could be the reason for that?
So this is a different three-letter acronym, EFS instead of WTF.
It
Excuse
does
my
feel like
language.
a WTF too, though.
Oh my, this is the one that has me screaming WTF at the end of
Yes.
the room.
Mhm.
So we're talking about something called empty follicle syndrome. This is actually a very broad term that's not really necessarily a super specific syndrome in the way that we think about it. So this is something that happens where you're doing an IVF, you're doing a retrieval, your follicles look great, the hormones are looking good, like your estrogen levels, and you're not getting eggs. There are no eggs, despite apparently normal follicular development, adequate stimulation. What's really important about empty follicle syndrome is that they do classify it into two types. So there's genuine empty follicle syndrome and false empty follicle syndrome. And we're going to go through both.
Genuine entry follicle syndrome happens when there are no eggs retrieved despite adequate levels of ACG level at the time of the aspiration, either ACG levels or a normal LH level. So both ACG levels or a high LH level, it's what you need for those eggs to mature. So that's what we call the trigger. The trigger could be an ACG based trigger or it could be an agonist based trigger, raises your LH levels. When we do an agonist trigger, we check the next day after the trigger to see that those levels went up. So if the levels went up, then we expect that there will be the expected number of eggs at the time of the retrieval. Also, when we give you an ACG trigger and there are no eggs at the time of the retrieval, we measure the ACG level in the blood on that day. And if it is a normal level of ACG, then it's what is called true or genuine entry follicle syndrome, which means everything was normal, including the hormones that you need for final follicle maturation. And there were still no eggs present. And this is usually related to some sort of mutation or genetic abnormality with the follicle, maybe not having the right receptors that it needed to mature, despite the normal hormone levels that are needed for follicle maturation.
Now, it's worth noting that this is super rare, people actually having these genetic mutations. I think I've seen one case.
Me too. Just one
Uh,
case in 15 years. Yeah.
yeah, when I was a fellow, when I was in training, there was, I think, one person where the fertility physician went so far as to do this type of genetic testing to look for specific genetic mutations that are kind of known. Genuine empty follicle syndrome is actually very, very rare. But again, it is something that can happen. And there's really no way to predict that that's going to be the case until you're actually at retrieval.
Now, there is also false entry follicle syndrome, which means that, again, the follicles are there, the retrieval happened, there were no eggs, but this time we can prove that there was not the appropriate level of ACG present to induce that follicle maturation. So, this could be related to errors in the ACG administration or error in the timing or usually an absorption problem of the ACG level. So that's what a false antifollicle syndrome is all about.
And so when we're wondering about this or when we're thinking about correcting it, false empty follicle syndrome can usually be managed by correcting the HC administration protocol, which is really important. If somebody's doing another cycle, there are ways to kind of work with it, meaning We might add more trigger medication, a more aggressive type trigger medication, maybe using HCG and the agonist, maybe higher doses, maybe administering them differently. So sometimes it's subcutaneous versus intramuscular. Sometimes we might play with the timing, meaning the time of trigger to the time of retrieval. In cases, maybe we might sort of increase it potentially to try and give that trigger medication more time to work. But there are ways that we can troubleshoot and have a good chance of doing way better in a subsequent cycle.
And in terms of genuine entry follicle syndrome, sometimes there are some genetic screening that can be done to look for mutations. However, not every mutation has been identified for this.
Mhm.
So you might do genetic screening and come back negative simply because the mutation that you have hasn't been identified yet. Another thing that I've noticed is sometimes, especially people that have decreased ovarian reserve or people that are a little bit older, they tend to have this problem a bit more. I think when you have a mutation, you might have like no eggs at all. When you don't have a mutation and it might be related to decreased ovarian reserve, you might notice that you have 5 follicles and 2 of them contain an egg and 3 of them had entry follicle syndrome. So that could be more related to the fact that sometimes follicles develop the receptors to the FSH, which is the hormone that we gave you, without actually having an egg inside of them.
Mhm, mhm. And it's so hard to know whether the follicle contains an egg or not, or whether the egg didn't mature and kind of become ready for ovulation because we poke a follicle, we drain the follicle. We don't know whether we just didn't get the egg because the egg wasn't mature or whether the follicle never contained an egg. I mean, these are all questions that we can't answer, unfortunately. And that's what makes things so frustrating.
That's why it's called WTF.
Exactly. Kind of on the other end of the spectrum, I guess. Another thing that can happen at the time of retrieval that's going to give us less eggs than we expected is premature ovulation, meaning that the follicles were there, they looked good, and then you get to retrieval and the follicles seem to be gone. They seem to have disappeared, meaning that we think that they've ovulated too early or prematurely. This is uncommon. Please don't panic. The risk of premature ovulation happens, I would say for sure, less than 5% of the time, and maybe even less than that. It's definitely not a common scenario.
This can happen even when you do everything perfectly because sometimes ovaries just don't listen to instructions and don't follow the test books. So even when you do everything perfect, sometimes you just ovulate earlier than expected. It can also happen due to missteps, maybe missing a dose of the antagonist, maybe taking it a little bit later, maybe doing the ACG trigger or the trigger medication earlier than you were scheduled to do. But again, sometimes when you do everything perfectly, that can still happen.
There are some risk factors for premature ovulation. Some things that might increase the risk of this happening. For instance, somebody who has a lower egg reserve, decreased ovarian reserve, I would say that there's a higher chance of premature ovulation, or we see it more commonly. Increasing patient age is another situation where we may see a slightly higher risk of premature ovulation. Of course, if they've had premature ovulation before, that makes us super nervous that it could happen again. The other one is when the stimulation cycles get really long. A typical stimulation might be in and around plus or minus 12 days. But once you're getting to more than 14, 15 days, especially when you're on the antagonist for a longer period of time, then the risk of premature ovulation, that kind of breakthrough, is certainly higher. But I will say that even with these risk factors, there's still a large group of patients who have premature ovulation who don't have any of the risk factors, unfortunately.
We have spent some time explaining some of the reasons that we don't get as many eggs as we expected. Now, let's talk about how we counsel patients when we are faced with these scenarios. The first thing is compassion, 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 empathy. This is really hard. And we've been mentioning that it's hard for us as fertility specialists, but we never forget that it's 100 times harder for you, our patients, who are putting all of their hopes, dreams, time, finances into getting these precious, precious eggs. So we don't underestimate how hard it is for you. And we work really hard at making you feel heard and validating your feelings and letting you know that we understand and we support you and we want to come up with solutions to help you move forward with other treatment cycles.
Absolutely. Really, all of these WTF appointments, the common theme is that I always start with finding out how people are doing, how people are
Mhm.
feeling, what they're doing to cope with their emotions. Let's say if there's more than one partner, how both partners are doing. Are they talking to each other about this? Kind of what's the situation? That's always the place to start because having that discussion is really important. Validating those feelings, validating that experience is so important, right? I mean, there's time to talk about the science, there's time to talk about all that stuff too, of course, but that's always the place to start for sure.
And of course, patients always ask, can I do another cycle and is this going to happen again? And that is where experience and science comes together along with the empathy and compassion. And then that's where we go over risk factors like what the protocol look like, how many IVF cycles have you done, what has happened before, whether we need to increase the dose of the medication, decrease the dose of the medication, whether we need to look at alternative options for building your family, whether we need to do different triggers, whether we need to do a different medication for preventing ovulations. Do we need to give you a double dose of the medication to prevent ovulation? Do we need to do a retrieval at a different time compared to the trigger than you did before? So there is a lot of things that we can do to hopefully get a better outcome next time. And I would say the majority of the times we do. But unfortunately, I mean, everybody kind of wish it wasn't trial and error for sure. This is spoken as somebody who went through 5 IVF cycles myself to have my kids. So absolutely, I wish I could just do it once and get the outcome that I wanted. But there is a lot that we can tweak in other protocols if you wanted to keep going. So it's not usually the end of the road.
There is also an element of luck to it though. And that's a really tough one for me to talk about, actually, I have to say, when I'm talking to patients, because I don't think anybody wants to hear that there is an element of luck or sometimes it's just bad luck. I have a really hard time talking about that one or addressing that, but
It feels
it
unscientific,
it
right?
feels unscientific and it feels like a cop out.
Right.
Like it feels like I'm providing somebody with a cop out, like, oh, it's just bad luck. That's not where it's coming from at all. Sometimes a protocol and your flow sheet and everything can look absolutely perfect. And sometimes things just don't work out. I think that there is a lot of variability person to person. I think everybody's physiology is a little bit different. And as much as we talk about personalization and personalizing the protocol to the person, the individual in front of us, we actually don't know how to personalize all the parts. For instance, when somebody is doing their first ever IVF cycle, I'm going to do the 36-hour trigger, 36 hours from trigger to retrieval. Am I personalizing that to the patient? No, I'm not. That's also because I don't have a way to predict that that is good for them or that that is bad for them. And if I go too long, like if I overshoot, we can have premature ovulation. If I undershoot, we might have immature eggs or not get the eggs. And, we might have empty follicle syndrome then.
Right.
This is to say that everybody talks about personalization of protocols and wanting a personalized protocol. And I 100% believe in that. And I absolutely agree in that. But there are limitations in terms of what we know and what we can do.
Yeah, we personalize what we can. We look at their AMH, we look at their intrafollicle count, we look at their prior IVF experience, we look at their age, we look at how many children they want to have. Are they doing PGT? Are they doing a fresh transfer? There is actually a lot of personalization that we do because there are about 100 decisions that we have to make to set up an IVF protocol. And some of those decisions are very personalized, and some of them are not because you just don't have the information to make them personalized.
It's also important to mention that we're also tracking people's cycles through the whole stimulation too. A lot of things you might change during the stimulation. For instance, the time from trigger to retrieval. If somebody is showing that the LH is sort of maybe creeping up, if somebody maybe is on antagonist twice a day because their LH was creeping up, That's somebody where I might think about shortening the time from trigger to retrieval. And so watching the stimulation itself and kind of modifying things, being flexible is really important. But again, there is still that element of luck, unfortunately. I love what I've heard you say before. The ovaries didn't read the textbook. Just because I did doesn't mean the ovaries did. And so they might be doing their own thing. And that's just a fact of where we're at with our current understanding of the human body.
Now, let's talk about some real patient stories on perspective because there is the science, there is the explanations, but sometimes even when you have that moment where you didn't get as many eggs as possible, the overall outcome can still be very good. And I certainly have lots of stories like that. So I'm going to start with one. This is a patient of mine. This baby is probably now about 2 years old, and she came for her retrieval. She had a lot of eggs. And again, we got into those problems that we're talking about before. She was a little bit overweight. The ovaries were moving constantly. I would put a needle and they would like bounce off. We couldn't quite see safely. And we did all the maneuvers like pressure, the whole thing. And at the end of the day, I only was able to get one egg out of, I think she had 12. However, that one egg fertilized and it turned into a genetically normal embryo because she wanted to do PGT. And that embryo was transferred and it turned into the beautiful, healthy baby. And she has actually shared the story on Instagram. I won't tell you her handle because she hasn't given me permission to do that, but that's the way that went.
That's fantastic. That's a beautiful story. And it is absolutely true. I mean, you never know how a cycle is going to go until it's over. People talk about it being a roller coaster. That's because there are constant ups and downs and twists and turns. And you really don't know where you're going to end up until it's the end of the
Yeah,
cycle.
and for sure, I remember I did that retrieval to my patient. I had that conversation with her, and she was very upset. I was very upset. But at the end of the day, we looked at each other and we both said it. All it takes is one. And throughout her journey from fertilization to PGT testing to transfer, every time she saw me, she kept saying, I keep repeating it 100 times a day. All it takes is one. All it takes is one. And she just kept using that sentence and holding on to that. And yeah, it worked.
I can think of a patient that I had who came to me after having done previous IVF cycles. I was lucky to have extra information and to know a little bit more about her ovaries. So I was entering this and from a very privileged position, I will say, but she had a history of premature ovulation. I think she had prematurely ovulated like twice before. Her egg reserve was very low. Her cycles were already irregular. She was perimenopausal. And so we were planning another IVF cycle. We had to do IVF, I believe, because partner sperm was poor. And so there was no opportunity for thinking about things like IUI or intercourse, for instance. And that's why we still really wanted to move forward with IVF. And I remember having a really frank discussion with her. And I said, well, I don't know what your time from trigger to retrieval should be. I really don't know. X number of hours has been tried, Y number of hours has been tried, Z number of hours has been tried, with the more antagonists and trying to suppress the ovulation and all this. And I said, you know what? I told her arbitrarily, I picked a number in terms of trigger to retrieval. I said, I'm picking this number because I just think that maybe it's going to be a good number. I don't have a textbook about this. I really have never done a retrieval this number of hours post trigger. If you want to try, I'm down to try. And we're going to keep our fingers crossed and we're going to get that egg. I think it was 30 hours trigger to retrieval, which I've never done before. And lo and behold, the egg was there and the egg was mature and she
Wow.
had a beautiful baby. I told her I picked that number with a little bit of insight, but really it was just sort of picking from my heart. And so, again, at the end of the day, all it takes is one is absolutely true. And number two, sometimes we and the patients both have to recognize, have frank conversations about expectations, but we will still try. We will still do the things and we're still going to do our very, very best to try and make the next retrieval as successful as possible.
I have another case that I remember. A patient had about 15 follicles and she ovulated prematurely, one of the things that we talked about, but we were able still to get 6 eggs out of 15. Some of them, we got them out of the fluid around the ovaries. It's called the cul-de-sac. So sometimes there is fluid there and we can quickly aspirate it. That does not happen very often. We can aspirate the fluid all day long.
That's advanced stuff, expert level stuff right there, okay? Just
Yeah.
for those of you who are listening.
Yeah, aspirating the fluid, it's not hard. It's just getting eggs within that fluid is really hard because
Yeah.
the eggs are just like all over the abdomen and you have to be extremely lucky. So I think what happened to me is that I must have aspirated probably the second the eggs had come out and they hadn't had a chance to float away yet. But anyhow, we got 6 eggs out of 15, not as many as we wanted, but out of the 6 eggs, she got 5 blastocysts. Now, she wasn't doing genetic testing. She did have a baby. So, yes, one of them was euploid for sure. I don't know about the other ones, but getting, 5 embryos out of 6 eggs highlights that sometimes it's not the number that matters, but the quality that's really
Mhm.
important.
Mhm. Mhm. And on the flip side, I know we both have patients who've had empty follicle syndrome. Well, not necessarily genetic issues. Let's call it false empty follicle syndrome. We've done modifications, we've changed up the triggers, and we've gotten eggs a second time around. I know you had a recent pretty crazy case.
That's right. There is hope. The WTF appointment is not something that anybody wants to experience. And we do everything that we can so that you don't experience that. But it is not you, it is biology. So it doesn't mean that you've done anything wrong. It doesn't mean that you fail. Like I said, once again, sometimes your ovaries or your bodies, they just don't follow instructions or they don't read the test book. When that happens, we are here. We are here for you. We'll go through the process, what worked well, what didn't work well, and then we can always find little tweaks to do to your protocol to give you a better outcome next time. Because remember that fertility treatment is a marathon. It is not a sprint. And just because you lost one battle, it doesn't mean that you have lost the entire war.
Absolutely. And if you're listening to this episode and you've gone through a retrieval where you've gotten less eggs than expected, hopefully this episode will be a jumping off point for you to be able to connect with other patients who've had similar situations, because you are absolutely not alone by any means. And you're not broken by any stretch either. Your ovaries are not broken either. It happens, unfortunately, but by no means does it mean that your story is over. And by no means does it mean that you are never going to build a family that you want. You can still absolutely get there.
And if this happened to you, yeah, share your story. Let us know in the comments. It's going to help us as fertility doctors, but it's also going to help everybody else out there going through something similar.
And of course, this is the first in our series of the WTF appointments. If you have any specific issues, questions, you've gone through a WTF appointment, you want us to do an episode, please send us a DM because we would love to address all of those things as well.
As we conclude today's episode, I also want to mention that you might want to listen to episode 2, which is about the menstrual cycle. That's actually one of my favorites, as well as episode 33, which talks about the impact of decreased ovarian reserve on fertility and on IVF treatments.
And that's a wrap for today, Superhumans.
If you're looking to connect, get social with us. Follow us on YouTube and Instagram at My Fertility Podcast or visit us online at markandfertility.com. And don't forget, follow, subscribe, and share your favorite episode.
Thanks for listening to My Fertility Podcast and for being a vital part of our community. We know you've got this.
We're signing off until next Tuesday.
If you found this episode of My Fertility Podcast helpful, please take a moment to head over to the review section and leave us your thoughts. Your reviews and comments are incredibly valuable to us and help guide future episodes. We also welcome you to direct your questions to info@myfertilitypodcast.com.
My Fertility Podcast is produced by Rabbit Media Inc. in conjunction with Dr. Garcia and Dr. Weiss.
Music from Mixkit, Life is a Dream by Michael Ramirez C.
My Fertility Podcast is not intended to replace any type or variation thereof professional medical, health, or legal advice, nor should the content be taken as medical advice. Please contact your primary healthcare professional regarding any medical questions you may have. The information presented in this podcast is based on the knowledge and understanding of the host at the time of recording. Medical knowledge is constantly evolving, and new research may change the understanding of health-related topics. While we strive to provide accurate and up-to-date information, we do not guarantee the completeness, accuracy, or timeliness of the content. The views expressed in this podcast by guests are not those of the host or the management. This podcast is not intended to impose any type of discrimination. My Fertility Podcast and its management are not responsible for any losses, damages, or liabilities that may arise from the use of this podcast.